Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Well, these are the figures the economic world has been waiting for, the September quarter CPI, because it is an indication of what the Reserve Bank is going to do with interest rates. Now, quite a reasonable figure that was released yesterday for the September quarter, but underlying inflation is still too high. Leith Van Onselen joins us from Macro Business. G'day, Leith.
G'day, Clinton. How are you?
I'm good. The big question, obviously, is the Reserve Bank going to now cut interest rates? But given the inflation rate, the underlying inflation rate, is still above 3%, probably not yet.
No, mate. I think definitely the Reserve Bank's going to hold off until next year based on this data. Now, this opens up a very, very interesting war of words that's probably going to erupt between the federal government and the Reserve Bank. So we all know that the federal election's due in, has to be due before 20th of May next year. So we're going to go to the polls. That's locked in. It has to be May next year. So the federal government is obviously sweating on the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates. So we're seeing interest rate cuts around the world, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, UK. Inflation's coming down in all those places. And obviously we've got a cost of living crisis. We're looking at sort of a hung parliament, the way things are standing at the moment. So it's going to be a very, very tight result. And the federal government needs the RBA to cut rates before it goes to the polls. Now, yesterday's data was interesting. So on the one level, the headline inflation rate, so that's the one you hear about in the news, et cetera, was a good result. So inflation went up by 0.2% in the third quarter. Now, that was the lowest since the second quarter of 2020. And it's below economists' expectations of 0.3%. The annual result came in at 2.8%, so that's within the RBA's band. Now, the reason why it's a bit misleading is because the inflation was pulled lower by the federal government's electricity subsidies. So as you know, where the federal government's had now electricity rebates, all those sorts of things, and that actually lowered the headline inflation rate by 0.4%. So it would have been 0.6% without that. And then we also had the fall in petrol prices now, which pulled down inflation by 0.25%. Now, Treasury Jim Chalmers was out there spruiking the results, saying that inflation's the 4-year low, it's within the RBA's band, etc., which is basically a veiled swipe at the RBA, trying to sort of egg it on to cut interest rates. However, the RBA's been at pains to say that it's going to ignore the headline result because of the subsidies, and it's going to instead look at what underlying inflation or trimmed mean inflation. Now, what that is, that's basically the inflation rate when you take out the 10% most volatile items, both the 10% of items that are the highest and the 10% that are the lowest. And because of the subsidies, so that basically pulls the subsidies out of the equation. And the underlying inflation, which is what the RBA is going to look at, came in above target at 0.8% for the quarter and 3.5% year on year. So it was above target both on a quarterly basis and on an annual basis. And what this means is that Australia's core inflation is too high still. It's among the highest in the world still. And what this basically means is that the RBA has said that that's what they're going to focus on, and it means that the RBA is going to remain on hold until next year. Now, as I said, this potentially leads to a stoush between the RBA because the government wants them to cut the headline inflation rates below target. I'll point out that the RBA's charter, the Objectives and Monetary Policy Charter, actually says that CPI should remain within target. The headline CPI, it doesn't say anything about the trim mean, but the RBA is choosing to look at the trim mean. So that means that Treasurer Jim Chalmers can point to that. The RBA can point to the fact that core inflation remains sticky, and that's why it's going to be an interesting time watching the federal government try and pressure the RBA to cut rates and the RBA to push back.
So
popcorn.
Okay, so it doesn't happen over December based on these figures. So you're thinking maybe February, but the thing about February, this is from my uneducated mind here, Leith, there is so much development in an economy over the summer period because you've got that whole Christmas retail period. And who knows at this point how that's going to fare. So you'd be wrong to lock in an interest rate cut yet for February, wouldn't you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think we can definitely rule one out next week. I mean, next week's a certainty not to cut.
Yep.
And based on the fact we're not going to get another quarterly, inflation figure until January, you'd expect that December's out of the question as well, unless we get a massive rise in unemployment or something, out of the box happens. So that means that the next meeting after December is February. But there's certainly no guarantees that they're going to cut in February. And As you've just said, there's a lot of water to go under the bridge until then. So we're going to see, we'll obviously get all the Black Friday, the Christmas retail results, all those sorts of things. We'll also get a few unemployment prints. So anything could happen. But I think, most economists are sort of saying February. A couple are saying, it could be even later than that. But if it's later than that, it's going to really, pressure the government before the election, because the government will be banking on, rate cuts, at least a couple rate cuts heading into the election, not just maybe one.
Yeah.
And, just to really save its bacon politically, because it can't really go into the next election without a rate cut when the rest of the world's cutting. And, you've got obviously households still under a lot of pain, et cetera, because it'll get blamed for it.
The report,
it's interesting times.
the report that was released into the government's handling of the COVID pandemic did point the finger at the previous government about the amount of stimulus they provided. Mind you, Labor was in full support of that and probably would have gone even further. Can we look at the inflation figures now, and can that all be traced back to the COVID pandemic?
Oh, certainly not all of it. Some of it can, for sure. So in the report, they said that, the inflation rate would have peaked at around 6% without the stimulus, instead of peaking at 8%. So they reckon it added about 2% of inflation, which is probably fair. I mean, it probably did. But what I will say, though, Clinton, is hindsight's 2020. And as we went into obviously we went into the pandemic, everyone thought it was going to be worse than it was when it happened, if you think back to it. And yes, look, the government did overstimulate. There's no doubt about it. The JobKeeper subsidies were too generous. They went on for too long. You had the early access to super. The most egregious one, in my view, was the cash flow boost for business, where we basically handed $36 billion to businesses without any need for them to pay it back. It was just a cash gift. And then obviously we had also the home builder subsidies, which in hindsight was a pretty poor choice when you've got a supply constrained construction industry. You don't want to stimulate that because it'll just add to inflation. So look, certainly there's a lot of mistakes made. But hindsight is 2020, and I will add that the rest of the world also made the same mistakes. So, Australia has had this inflation spike, but it was a global inflation spike. So the UK, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, we all had similar inflation spikes. We all did similar things. All governments made a mistake. All governments overstimulated. And what effectively happened is all the governments pumped money into the economy at the same time as global supply chains became stretched and bottlenecked. And what that meant is we had less supply but more demand, and then that obviously pushed up prices, which is what we've had. What's obviously happened, and obviously some of the quality of that stimulus in hindsight was questionable. But again, hindsight's 2020. Labor was asking for even more stimulus at the time, by memory. So I can't really pin the blame on the previous government. Labor would have done exactly the same thing. And what I will also add is that, of course, mistakes were made, but I'd also argue that the Albanese government has contributed to the problem by deliberately running, a massive immigration program, which was engineered in the Jobs and Skills Summit when they got in. And that's also lifted aggregate demand. And then they've also, embarked on some pretty stupid energy policies, which have also contributed to inflation. And of course, we've seen record government spending. So government spending as a share of the economy hit an all-time high, 27.3%. in the June quarter. It's never been that high before. It's projected to go even higher, and a lot of that's related to the NDIS spending and et cetera. So, look, both governments have contributed to the inflation issue. Coalition over the pandemic, which all the world's governments did, and then obviously, Labor's done some silly things since then as well. So that's just the way it is. Everyone's an expert in hindsight, me included, and no one's got, no one can read the future perfectly. So, I think we need to cut the former government some slack, although some of the measures that it did bring out were a bit silly.
Well, there was
probably excessive, and let's be fair, they weren't pulled back quick enough. That's for
absolutely,
sure.
absolutely. I mean, the one that jumped out at me was JobKeeper, when you had some casuals who were working maybe a few hours a week and maybe a couple of $100 a week being paid thousands suddenly.
Yeah, absolutely, and they did go on too long. So it was pretty clear after about the first 3 months or so, or maybe 6 months. Sorry, the first 6 months. That the pandemic wasn't going to be as bad as they thought, and then yet they extended, I think, another 6 months by memory.
Yeah.
So it did drag too long, and that pumped too much money into the economy at the same time as the supply side was constrained, and then while you get inflation.
We can read all about economic issues on Macro Business. Great to talk to you, Leith. We'll catch up next week.
Speak next time.
Leith Van Olsen from Macro Business.